Hey everybody, welcome to midweek at Salem First Baptist. Have you heard the incredibly great news? Wait for it, wait for it. Here it is. No rain for the next 3 days. I knew you'd be excited. Yep. In fact, we might even go through the weekend. If you're a farmer and you want to get your hay in, that's the best news you've heard all month. I know you were expecting that we're going to get into phase 2. Well, that little church over in Union County didn't help us a whole lot, but we'll see. So, what's the news on that one? Your guess is as good as mine. We'll wait for tomorrow, and we'll see what our governor gives to us. We don't have any inside track information. If she says yes tomorrow in terms of us moving into phase 2, again, we won't do live services this weekend. We would just do the stream services. Why? Because it's going to take us time to do signups. We need to do signups because what will be given to us is 250 people. That means we have to do management of distribution. That means we have to do messaging in terms of preparation and all of those things. So we want to make sure that we do it well and get prepared. It's actually doable and really good. I was just talking to a friend who is in another state, and they are getting ready to launch this weekend. They were given their preparation guide by their state, and it's 5 pages. And so they're going to do this weekend, and they're so exhausted trying to prepare. So I actually feel pretty encouraged. We've had 4 meetings, each about 90 minutes. So we're in pretty good shape. We're ready, but we're waiting for the green light. In the meantime, what's happening? Well, we continue to trust God for His perfect timing, and we're getting ready to launch a number of new things. Yes, Fusion, they're doing great. They have, somebody told me this week, 70-some students in small group ministries. That's incredible. They're doing a great job. Thrive is doing the same thing. They're meeting. Next week, we're launching our community and here Bible studies. We're going to be studying Romans 12. If you haven't signed up for that, you still can. We've got well over 100. We're kind of probably cresting towards 150 people that are signed up for that. That's through Right Now Ministries, and if you haven't signed up for that, you can do that. You can either get online for Right Now, Right Now Ministries. So next week, we're going to be starting that. It's going to be really fun. We're going to be studying Romans 12 for 5 weeks, looking at community life. What better subject than during this time? So I hope you'll join that. If you don't know how to do it, you can either go online or you can call the office. So we'll look forward to that. That's, again, 5 weeks. And because you can't travel a whole lot, it's just going to be a perfect time to study that together. Another thing in terms of announcement, the annual business meeting is coming up. Our annual business meeting is the last week of this month, June. So you received a budget and you received a ballot and a letter from Steve, kind of an explanation of the budget and really a celebration. Again, thanks so much for your faithful giving. It's really incredible to see God's people so faithful in that. So thank you. And also, he kind of gave you an explanation how we're approaching the budget for next year. And so you'll see the ballot in there. What can you do with that ballot? You can mail it in. You can drop it by the church office. And we would love to have those back by the last weekend, which is 27th, 28th. And that's when we will close that. And we will be voting on the budget and also those who are going to be serving in those committees, deacons, deaconesses, the global mission team, property, and all of those important committees. So we appreciate those folks who are willing to serve, and we appreciate you and your participation in that. So a question that I get asked a lot right now is this issue. We've kind of moved not so much out of COVID, because that's still around. It still affects us every day. But one that I get asked on a daily basis, not once, not twice, but multiple times a day is, Pastor, what do you think of all the riots? What do you think of what's going on up in Seattle? Pastor, don't you think it's horrible about what's going on? And my stock answer is, what do I think of the riots? They make no sense. They're horrible. What do I think of the police? I think the police, by and large, are marvelous. Our staff, by the way, we're doing some things, kind of a special encouragement and gift to our police officers in our church. By the way, we're still serving our rest stop here, and we send notes and we're blessing our police officers. We have fantastic police officers here in Salem. They're doing a great job. I understand what happened. It's horrible what happened to George Floyd. But what do I think of the police? I think they're marvelous. Is there racism in the U.S.? Absolutely. Is there an issue of racism? Yes. Is it tragic? Yes. Has it been around for a long time? Yes. In fact, it's not even new for the church. If you go back into Galatians, if you go back into the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, it's right there in the text of Scripture. Oh, you could go all the way back into the Old Testament. It's prior to that. But if you look back into Ephesians chapter 2, there was this issue of the circumcised and the uncircumcised, the Jew and the Gentile. And it was splitting the church. It was this huge issue between Paul and Peter. You remember the story where Paul came in to Peter, and Peter was separating himself from other Gentiles. And Paul even came into Peter and said, Peter, have you changed the gospel? At the heart of it was Peter's view of other races that Paul attributed to the gospel. Is racism new? No, not at all. Is it something that we need to address as a church? Absolutely. Why? Because if we don't address it, other people will. And if they address it, they don't address it from a biblical perspective. They address it from a political perspective. They address it from a liberation theology perspective. They address it from a worldly perspective. And if they address it from those perspectives, it's not going to be helpful. It's going to be destructive. Now, you may not want to address racism. You may want to just kind of bury your head, or you may want to say, I don't want anything to deal with it. But as a follower of Christ, I actually don't think you have that option. I know I don't. And by the way, I think as a church that wants to be a church for the city that reaches the world for Christ, I don't think we have that option. Why? Because the gospel brings reconciliation between God and people, and between people and each other. See, that was the very vision of Christ, is that when Jew and Gentile came together, they would be one in Christ. That was as hard and difficult back then as it is today to see African American and white and Hispanic and white, or Asian and African American as it is today. It's not easy. It's hard to discuss. It's hard to discuss because added to it are the riots, and added to it are accusations of white supremacy and white privilege, and a lot of things that we tend to get defensive about. And so sometimes we back away from it and we're afraid of it. I understand that. So a number of years ago, when I was young, I was about 28 years of age, and Carrie and I moved to the inner city, and we knew nothing about racism, really. Oh, I read about it. I didn't know it. I hadn't experienced it. And God sent me a number of people along the way. One of them was John Perkins. He was out of Memphis, Tennessee. Another was a man by the name of Brian Larette. For those of you who have been around Promise Keepers, you'll remember both of those names. John Perkins one time came in and gave me, a young white pastor in the inner city, a half a day to just teach me, train me, help me see life from his perspective. Both of them were African-American men. Crawford Larette allowed me to ask questions that other people wouldn't. He didn't make me feel dumb. He didn't judge me. He didn't consider me a privileged individual. He considered me a young, oftentimes inexperienced student who he allowed me to grow. He helped educate me. He blessed me, and he prayed for me. I so appreciated those guys in my early days. And it's with that spirit that we as a staff want to invite our whole church into this process. Racism is hard to address. It's frightening. There's a lot of fire, and there's a lot of accusation and a lot of defensiveness. I was given an interview, made aware of an interview. It actually is with Brian Larette, Crawford's son. I hadn't stayed in connection at all with Crawford and John over the years. But when I saw Brian, it kind of brought me back to those days when, man, I was 28 and naive and didn't know much, and now I'm 58 and naive and don't know much. But man, it brought me back to those days when I had permission to grow and to ask questions, to have conversations. I watched this 30-minute video. It's an interview that Brian gave at a church in Tennessee last week on the 14th of June. I was really helped, encouraged by it. I know it's 30 minutes. It's a long time. But I'm going to ask you, would you give me 30 minutes? Would you give our church, would you give this subject 30 minutes and watch it? It's an invitation to grow. It's an invitation, permission to ask questions. Where do we go from here? It's not the answer. You may not like everything you see or hear. You may have questions that come out of it. That's okay. It's not us saying this is the position of the church. It's us as a staff saying, let's grow together. We're going to start putting together some things. We'll put it on the website. It's hard right now because we're not face-to-face. We're not gathering together. And so we will develop this together on the website and in other resources. And it's just developing the opportunity to grow together, to have permission to ask questions. Why? Because, my friends, as Brian says in this, the organizational movement of Black Lives Matter doesn't have good leadership and is off of the rails biblically. If the church doesn't step into this, it doesn't end well, and it doesn't represent the heart of God. So I think the church is obligated to come back to Ephesians 2, to come back to Galatians, to come back to the heart of Christ, and to say, what is the vision of God for the human race? What is the heart of God for people? So watch this if you would. It's 30 minutes.
Today we have a special guest to have a conversation about the moment that we find ourselves in. Dr. Brian Larette is one of the most prominent voices today in the space of racial reconciliation and multicultural church. He's authored 7 books. He co-founded Fellowship Memphis in 2003, and later he founded the Kanos Movement, an organization committed to seeing the multi-ethnic church be new and normal in our world. He even served for a season in New York City with our very own John Tyson. Would you please join with me in welcoming Dr. Brian Larette? Hey, my friend, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Darren. The first service, the microphone didn't work that well, and now it is, so yes.
See, it's a good thing.
Yes.
So I want to begin with just sort of talking about what is unique about the moment that we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah, and it does feel unique. I've said plenty of times, this just feels different in my life. I think to frame it, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, who is a white sociologist, she says one of the differences between our white brothers and sisters and people of color, especially African American, is that whites, for the most part, see themselves, and I don't attach any moral value to either of these, as a collection of individuals. Mm-hmm. In the African American experience, we're far more communal. So when something happens, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, there is just this communal collective grief we experience. And for those of us who are people of faith and we walk into church, there is this profound sense of, please say something, please say something, please say something. So we feel that. And I think when we answer your question, there has just been this mounting, it's been a heavy season. The Ahmaud Arbery, that shooting that's caught on camera, we felt that. Breonna Taylor, we felt that. And then right on the heels of this is George Floyd. And that's why I would say, secondly, the imagery of George Floyd's killing is unlike anything we've really seen as it relates to the involvement of cops. And it goes without saying, not most cops are bad, not many cops are bad. I believe that that's an outlier situation. I want to believe the best in that. But in most of the other incidents when people of color were killed at the hands of white cops, it's almost like in my mind I could go, I get it. Like, in some sense, these cops have a hard job, right? And you got a split second to figure out if that's a weapon, and then you fire and realize that was a hairbrush. I understand that part of it. This was different. I'm even listening to white cops on YouTube who are going, look, man, the rule in our profession is once the handcuffs are on, the fight is over. So here we see an African-American guy lying face down on the asphalt, handcuffed behind his back, a knee, like the imagery, a knee coming down on his neck. The officer has his hands in his pockets, almost a smug look on his face. Bystanders are yelling for him to let up. 3 other cops are kind of standing guard, looking the other way. And then on top of that, it's this coronavirus pandemic. We've been cooped up in a house, frustrated. Someone once asked me, what are you going to do when the pandemic subsides? Me and my wife are going to therapy. That's the first thing we're going to do, right? So you've got all this pent-up frustration, and it's just this profound tipping point that, and the other thing I'd say, I've never felt, what makes this different, I've never felt this much white empathy and advocacy over any other racial incident in my lifetime. So I think all of that contributes to this is different.
Yeah. And so if folks are watching the news and they're seeing people rioting, demonstrating, looting, how would you help people make sense of why they're even doing that?
Well, let me just begin by saying the rioting and the looting is morally wrong. We should not be doing that. So I make no excuses for that. Atlanta's African-American female mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, she made an impassioned plea, specifically to people of color. Go home. Half of the businesses in Atlanta are owned by minorities, and that's the other thing. It's irrational. Yeah. Like, in a lot of these settings, we are damaging our own communities. My pastor pastors in Inglewood, California, and he's been there coming up on 40 years. And he said the Rodney King LA riots, it took them over 20 years to recover from that. Wow. So the economic damage that happens. Now, that said, I don't excuse it, but when you get a group of individuals who feel powerless, voiceless, oppressed, marginalized, it's almost as if they're throwing a tantrum.
Yeah.
Trying to, when my oldest was about 2, I remember a time he was trying to get my attention and I was looking somewhere else. He literally put his hands on my face and turned my face in his direction. I think that's what the looting and the rioting is we don't have power. We want to turn. Do you see us?
Yeah.
I'm not excusing it. I'm not saying it's right.
Yeah.
But pay attention here.
Yeah. Well, in the middle of all of this, it's kind of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Talk to us about that for a second.
Yeah, so one of the things, I was just on a phone call with a group of African American leaders, and we're trying to figure out what the next step is. And what framed the discussion is the juxtaposition between what's happening now with the protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, and what happened in the 60s and the 50s during the Civil Rights movement. And one of the things that we've had to come to terms with, if you study history, in the 50s and 60s, that the Civil Rights movement was located in the church, both literally and figuratively. So we would literally meet in churches right before the march happened. And the leaders were just about all professed Christians who were also pastors. Dr. King, co-pastors Ebenezer there in Atlanta, Ralph David Abernathy, his best friend, likewise a pastor. And as they are galvanizing the troops for what's ahead, they would open up the Bible and would speak many times from the experience of the nation of Israel. And that's why I think it's important that our white brothers and sisters understand that historically, in the African American experience, there has always been this deep, abiding Old Testament affinity with Israel. They were in bondage. We were in bondage. Even in Dr. King's last sermon that he gave in Memphis, what does he say? I've been to the mountaintop. What is he doing? He's likening himself to Moses. And we as a people will make it. And the people are being likened to Israel. So it was a biblically saturated movement located in the center of the church, and we have wandered way far away from that. And I think now is the time, as I'm looking out, and I'm seeing this global movement, and how do we leverage that? And I'm also seeing a movement that's leaderless, and that does not have a collective moral underpinning. And that's got to get back to the church. And let me say this, when I say back to the church, I'm not talking about the black church only or the Hispanic church.
Yeah.
It also has to get back to the white church. Because one of the things our white brothers and sisters need to understand, and I didn't say this in the first service, let me caveat this. I'm uncomfortable with the phrase white privilege. And the reason why I'm uncomfortable with that phrase is it demonizes privilege for the sake of privilege. If privilege was innately wrong, Jesus Christ was innately wrong. Philippians 2, the great kenosis passage, is all about the privilege of Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant. So privilege is not inherently wrong. The question is not privilege, it's the stewardship of privilege. So I'm African American. I mean, my parents just celebrated 49 years of marriage. Okay? That's a measure of privilege. All of us in this room have been given a measure of privilege. Should I feel bad about that? No. What am I doing with that? So I would challenge our white brothers and sisters, don't feel bad about privilege. But we must inherently struggle with the question of how am I, as Tim Keller says, disadvantaging myself for the advantage of others. And we've got to each wrestle with that.
There are times I've heard you delineate the difference between activism and being a reconciler. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so activists are concerned with the what. They are issue driven. So police brutality, we've got to overhaul the system, so on and so forth. Reconcilers, and I'm getting this from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, that great passage when it says that we've been given as Christians the ministry of reconciliation. Now, in its immediate context, that's vertical. Sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Doing everything we can to be used of instruments to take people from death to life. But I also believe that's got horizontal implications. And so while activists are issues driven, dealing with the what, reconcilers are concerned not just with the what, but also the how. We're people driven. So I don't just want police brutality to end. I also understand, in contradistinction to James Cone, who died some years ago, the father of African American liberation theology, in his landmark book during the Civil Rights Movement, he talks about God of the oppressed, where Cone misses it. And this is hard for me to say as a black man, but it's true. The cross is not just for the lynched, it's for the lynch mob. It's not just for George Floyd, it's for Officer Darren. And so when I understand that, I want to be about bringing together those who were formerly at enmity with one another. And that is why love has got to be the badge of the believer.
Wow. Yeah. So you're already touching on this, but talk a little bit more about the role that racial reconciliation plays in the gospel.
Oh, Darren, this is so key. If you get nothing else I say, I want to exhort us all to be Ephesians 2 Christians. And if we're not careful, Darren, see, the brilliance of your question is if we don't thread what's happened on the streets of Minneapolis with George Floyd with the gospel, then we will make matters of justice an elective and not core curriculum. So as believers, we're not afforded the opportunity to a la carte our justice issues. In the Bible, Randy Alcorn points out, there's over 2,350 verses in the Bible that talks about God's heart for the poor, the immigrant, the widow, and the orphan. And at no point does God say, just pick one. Now, in modern day context, and I need you to hear me say this, I am vehemently opposed to abortion. And I understand in a crowd this size, both in this room, out on the lawn, viewing us, maybe at your TV, your computer, some of you have maybe talked a woman into an abortion, or if you had an abortion. God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is sufficient. And so, hear me say, my baby sister's adopted because my father, as an African-American man, said, I got to get in the game. And her mother was going to abort her. And my dad knew the mother and said, if you'll give her to me. Now my baby sister is loving Jesus, and she's an OBGYN, making tons of money in Michigan. I'm trying to get her to write those checks to our church. But anyways, But here's what I need to hear you need to hear me say. If you are passionate about life in the womb, but apathetic about life outside the womb, you're not pro-life. You're pro-birth. And this just isn't a call for one ethnicity. If you love Jesus, we've got to be passionate here. So it's important that you hear me say that. And so when I talk about being Ephesians 2 Christians, Ephesians 2 is beautiful because the first 10 verses is all about vertical reconciliation, what God in Christ has done for us. And the opening 3 verses, this is who we were before Christ. We were by nature children of wrath. If I was preaching that text in the 90s, I would say, I'd label it, we're naughty by nature. I didn't know if that would work in this crowd. In a chocolate crowd, that works. But
it's Music City.
Naughty by nature. And then verse 4, but God being rich in mercy. And then what does he say? For it is by grace you have been saved. By grace you have been saved. Man, that's awesome stuff, but keep reading. Beginning in verse 11, having talked about vertical reconciliation, now he goes into horizontal reconciliation. He says, let me talk about you Gentiles in the flesh. You don't need to spend a day in seminary to know he's now dealing with the issue of ethnicity. And he's saying the cross of Jesus Christ, Paul's verbiage, has dismantled the dividing wall of hostility. So now that wall is gone, that once segregated Jews from Gentiles. Now Jews and Gentiles can rush together in this local thing called the church and worship with one another in this new humanity. And so the brilliance of Ephesians 2 is he goes from vertical reconciliation to not just horizontal reconciliation, but horizontal reconciliation specifically as it relates to ethnic unity.
Yeah.
And so we've got to be passionate about that. And so I don't make friends with people who are racially different than me so I can get into heaven. But one of the ways I know that heaven's gotten into me is that I do life with people who don't look like, act like, think like, or vote like me.
Yeah.
So we've got to be Ephesians 2 Christians.
Wow. So good. So I remember a week and a half ago, almost 2 weeks ago, when I first saw the video of the death of George Floyd, I was horrified. And what I did is I just privately reached out to some of my closest African American brothers and sisters. And collectively got almost the same response from everyone. And that was, man, I'm tired. Yeah. I'm tired. People are tired of like just another conversation on race and the gospel. Like people are tired. And there's a sense of like, what can we do? Yeah. What would you say?
Yeah, that's, I've gotten those questions too. And I would say two broad things. Number one, let's not be quick to rush to solutions without first stopping to lament. If you bypass lament on your way to a quick resolution, that's going to lead to a cheap reconciliation. I need to stop and lament and listen. So real quickly, Dr. Tim Muehlhoff, professor at Biola, he's popularized something called the communication pyramid, which fundamentally says there's 5 levels of communication. And this is revolutionary in talking about ethnic relations and marriage and friendships. The most superficial level of communication is cliche. Good morning, how are you? You've communicated, but you really haven't said anything. Levels 2 and level 3 are where most guys hang out, sports center talk. Level 2 is facts, sharing what you know. Who's going to win the NBA championship this year, and who's the greatest of all time? Of course, Michael Jordan. And then level 3,
amen.
Level 3 is opinion, sharing what you think. But levels 4 and level 5 are the indicator lights of the deepest, healthiest relationships. Level 4 is emotive, that's sharing how I feel. And level 5 is transparency, it's sharing who I am. By the way, much of the Psalms that David writes are level 4 communication, which poses a huge hermeneutic challenge because we come with a level 2 grid. Yeah. So when David says in Psalm 55, send my enemies to hell, he's not interested in giving us a robust theology on how to treat our enemies. Right. He's just saying, this is how I feel. Yeah. So when ethnic incidents happen like George Floyd, African American community typically goes level 4. Historically, not so much in this incident, our white brothers and sisters stop at level 2. Hold on, we don't know the facts. Now, if you meet someone at level 4 with level 2 communication, it took me about 5 years in marriage to figure out that ain't good.
Yeah.
I've had to learn when my wife comes to me at level 4, if I really want to experience deep oneness and intimacy with her, I got to drop down to her level of communication before we resurface back up to level 2. So all I'm saying is lament is all about level 4. It is sitting in the ashes. It is, as Paul says in Galatians 6, bearing one another's burdens and so fulfilling the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is just Christianity 101. The second big thing I would say, now we get to solutions. So you lament. In the Bible, God has created 3 institutions to deal with the problem of sin. the family, the government, and the church. All three of these must work in tandem if we are going to see progress in this area of race relations. Number one is the family. It's the family. And what that means of us as Christians, Deuteronomy 6, Psalm 78, is I got to view myself as the father and my wife as the mother. We're the tenured professors in our home. Mm-hmm. We are teaching and discipling our kids. They're like arrows. Psalm 127 says that we are launching out. I tell my sons, you're arrows, not boomerangs. You're getting released. We ain't throwing you out to come back home. It's another sermon for another time. Can somebody please say amen on that? And part of what this means is, Darren, my discipleship of them has got to be holistic. I don't just deal with their spirit, I also deal with matters of ethnicity. And I give them a robust, not just soteriology, where I teach them about the doctrine of salvation and how to share your faith and praying and quiet times. I also give them a robust anthropology. Psalm 139, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. This is my challenge as a black man parenting in 2020, is when I give my kids their first driving lesson, it is not here's the gas, here's the brake. It's what to do when the white cop pulls you over. Hands clear so they can see. No sudden movements. I know you're angry, but don't show anger. Yes, sir. No, sir. Sir, I'm about to put my hands in the glove box to give you my registration. Do I have your permission? I need you to come home safe to me. And my challenge as a black father is the tension is how do I give them wisdom without creating a sense of bitterness and suspicion towards white people? Because they're not the enemy. We're to love them. But also to my white brothers and sisters, I would say to you, Angela Davis, that great UCLA professor, she says, it's never good enough to not be racist. We must be anti-racist. So when Uncle Bob puts his feet under your Thanksgiving table and tells a racially insensitive joke, I need you all to create awkward biblical moments where you cut that off at the pass. Secondly is the government, and we've already talked some about this. And listen, we understand that the kingdom of heaven cannot nestle neatly in any one particular party. So if you're a believer, you go to the voting booth, there should be this tension. That I like what this party's saying over here, but I also like what this party's saying over there. And you pray, and Romans 14, you vote your conscience. However, we've got to stop letting CNN and Fox News and MSNBC discipling us more than Jesus.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about issues of injustice, on the federal level, if your conviction is life in the womb, and I think every Christian should have that conviction, okay, you may want to vote one way, but policing, that vote actually gets handled and cast on the local level. Mm-hmm. And so we also need to pay attention to these matters. Now we get to the third institution. I'm grateful for Dr. King and John Lewis and Ralph David Abernathy and Andrew Young. And because of them, as a black man, I can sit on any seat in the bus that I want. I can drink out of any water fountain that I want. I can sleep in any hotel that I want. But the shortcoming of the civil rights movement is that while it could change laws, it could not change hearts. That's the institution of the church. With the Spirit of God pulsating through it. You read Jeremiah and Ezekiel, God says the promise of the new covenant is, here's how I'm going to change you. I'm going to change you not by just demanding better behaviors, because your hands are an extension of your heart. I'm going to change your hands by dealing with your heart first. I'm going to rip out the heart of stone, give you a heart of flesh. Transformation happens from the inside out. And that is why this movement has got to be located back in the church, because we have the real solutions. But secondly, as it relates to the church, that's why I'm passionate about the multi-ethnic church as being the new normal. Yeah. That's why I sold my house in Silicon Valley and moved to North Carolina, and I'm at a 12,000 person church that's about 95% white, and we're trying to turn this thing around because the power, imagine with me, Officer Darren in a small group with George Floyd, both covered by the blood of Jesus, sharing their life. What happens? Proximity breeds empathy.
Yes.
when I'm doing life with people who see it differently, when I'm sharing dinners with people who don't look like, act like, think like, or vote like me, that's going to change me. I can always tell people who don't have friendships with what Dr. King called the other, because you speak in stereotypes, in generalizations, in sound bites that you got from a certain news channel.
Yeah.
But when you do life, now there's empathy. And so those three institutions, boy, if we have that, now we're seeing change.
What does it look like for a church with a heart for the city that wants to reach the world for Christ? What does it look like for us to represent Jesus' heart for all people and to lead with the message of the gospel that reconciles people to God and people to each other? Feel free to email us, begin the discussion. And by the way, we're going to put out more material and more resources. And if you find something that's helpful, not political, not condemnatory, helpful in representing the heart of Christ and giving us an avenue to move forward to grow, please, we want to see it. We want to become aware of it. We want to let the church know, because we want to begin a journey of growing together. Just like Crawford and John gave me 30 years ago. We want to do that again. It's our gift to the city. It's our obligation to Christ. God bless you. I love you. I cannot wait to see you face to face this weekend. Psalm 88, we're back at it again. Don't settle for normal. It's a good one. I'm looking forward to this. It's how do I face these evil days? By the way, again, don't forget, sign up for the Bible studies. Look forward to joining you. We have a good time studying the Word of God together. I love you. See you soon.